class, we're going to talk about what protein denaturation is and what it isn't. All right, so denaturation is when we have a protein that loses its biological activity. This usually results from a disruption of the secondary, tertiary, quaternary structure. So when we talk about that, usually when you're talking about secondary and tertiary and quaternary structure, you're talking about the shape of the protein. You're disrupting the bonds that take that single chain of amino acids and fold them in on themselves. And as we've been discussing, the shape of a protein is directly connected to the function of the protein. So if I were to change the shape of the protein, I therefore will change the function, or I will disable the function. I won't have that same biological activity that I should have for that protein. What does not get changed is the primary structure. So that sequence of amino acids does not get changed. And this is such a basic drawing, but each one of these circles represents an amino acid. There is one amino acid after another, after another, after another. That primary sequence does not change. And that's important to make that note because this often gets confused with mutation. We've heard that term before in our biology classes. Mutation is a change in the nucleotide sequence of a molecule. This will eventually result in a change, potentially, depending on the type of mutation, in the amino acid sequence. So when we say mutation, we're talking about swapping out one of those nucleotides that's responsible for telling our ribosomes which order of amino acids to add when building these proteins. And it's okay if this is a little fuzzy right now. We are going to go into this more in our last unit when we talk about protein synthesis. But just understand that you cannot use the terms mutation and denaturation in place of each other. You have to use one or the other. And denaturation is just changing the shape of the protein and losing function, whereas a mutation is a change in the DNA sequence. All right, so let's talk about some things that can denature your proteins. The first, and I think the most obvious, to me at least, is heat or UV light. So you can always think of cooking when you think of this. If you were to think of an egg comes out, the whites are clear. As you cook it, you're actually denaturing the proteins. So you're kind of unfolding those proteins in their three-dimensional shape. And like with a lot of denaturation, what you're doing is going to be irreversible. You can't take a cooked egg and work backwards to a raw egg again. That will change the proteins forever. When you cook, you're disrupting London forces, hydrogen bonds. Also, when you expose your proteins to UV light, the same thing is happening. So you're changing permanently, usually changing the structure of the protein and therefore losing your biological function. Acids and bases can also denature proteins. I like to think of lactic acid, which is a weaker acid, but lactic acid is what's responsible for souring milk to make cheese. So it's not always a bad thing. But once you have that lactic acid interacting with your milk, you're going to start to denature those milk proteins. You can't go from cheese back to milk. That will be a permanent change. Another way we can denature proteins are through the presence of organic compounds. Ethanol, which is the drinking kind of alcohol, or isopropyl alcohol, which is the rubbing kind of alcohol. These are used as disinfectants because they denature proteins in your bacteria or anything else you don't want to come in contact. So once you have exposed yourself to these organic compounds, your proteins become denatured, you lose biological function that way. This is one of those reasons that we ask you to wear nitrile gloves in lab, is because we don't want your beautiful finger proteins to get denatured. Heavy metal ions is going to come up in lab for you guys. Heavy metal ions, silver, lead, mercury. When these guys are in the presence of proteins, they're going to interact with sulfurs in your R groups as well as carboxylic acids. And this is going to disrupt your tertiary and quaternary folding. So you definitely don't want to ingest any of these because they're going to denature your proteins permanently. And finally, agitation. I think of whipped cream. If you were to heavily agitate or say whip, heavy whipping cream, hence the name, you would create whipped cream. What you're doing is you're denaturing and kind of unfolding those proteins in the secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures. Also, you can think of meringue, where you take egg whites and you beat the egg whites, or you agitate those egg whites. You cannot go backwards from that. You have denatured the proteins and they cannot fold again. So those are more than a couple different ways to denature proteins, and those are the specific ones that we're going to kind of stick to in class. All right, so this is the best job your book could do at showing us visually what's happening with our proteins. So we are imagining that every single one of these little circles that's stuck together represents an amino acid. Our functioning protein is going to take on this tertiary or quaternary shape. So it has, this is just not realistic, but we're going with it. When you apply heat or UV light or organic compounds or any of those other denaturing things, what it's going to do is going to kind of loosen and uncoil your protein. So now we have a denatured protein that no longer has the same biological function, because we know that the function of the protein is directly connected to the shape of the protein. We're going to see more of that when we talk about enzymes soon. So here are examples. Cooking eggs are a denaturing event. When you apply heat to something and you cook it, that is an irreversible denaturation. You're unfolding those proteins. We do cook meat a lot of times to tenderize it, because those proteins are going to start to unfold. They become easier for us to chew, although you can always overcook your meat and you've undone all that good as well. Another example of a denaturizing agent, I'm going with it, would be meat tenderizer. Meat tenderizer has papain in it, which is from the papaya. And that is a meat tenderizer, and essentially all it's doing is it's breaking down the protein structure. So if you have a tough cut of meat or a cheaper cut of meat, you add some of that meat tenderizer on it, denatures the proteins, again loosening it up before you cook it. So it's going to become even tender after cooking. Other ways that you can also prepare your meat before cooking would include adding an acid, and I'm not saying go add hydrochloric acid because that's not kitchen safe, but you could always add, say, soda to a steak and let it marinate in a soda, or vinegar, salad dressing. I've heard of people doing it in egg whites too. I'm not so sure how that turns out, but there's a lot of different ways to denature your meat and marinate it. We call it marinating and cooking before you cook it, so that it's more tender once it's cooked.